Plan for America podcast is a show dedicated to national unity through prosperity that's achieved by free market capitalism. We believe that a rising tide does lift all boats. This show will be positive, solution-oriented, and nonpartisan. Our only agenda is for the prosperity of our country and her people. All are welcome here. This show will not be argumentative or incendiary, sensational, or polarizing and divisive. What we are presenting is a positive solution to one of America's greatest problems. Hello and welcome to Plan for America podcast. I'm your host, Eric Nager, coming to you from the corporate offices of Indy TV in Fairhope, Alabama. My special guest today is Dan Mitchell, who's the chairman of the Center for Freedom and Prosperity. Dan, thank you for being our guest today.
I'm glad to be on the show.
And I see you're a Georgia Bulldog fan, so congratulations. Tell us, please introduce yourselves to our audience. If you could tell us where you're from, your background, your education, and what you did prior to CFNP.
Well, I'm an economist by training. I did my undergrad and master's at the University of Georgia, so I'm very happy about the national title victory. I was in Indianapolis for that glorious moment. I then went up to George Mason University for the PhD in economics, and I've been working in the think tank nonprofit world up in Washington. A brief stint on Capitol Hill as well, but I'm chairman of the Center for Freedom and Prosperity, which is a relatively small think tank by DC standards that focuses largely on issues of related to free markets, and especially our niche is international and jurisdictional competition. In other words, making governments compete so it's harder for them to overtax and overspend.
That sounds great. What are some examples of governments you've worked with or projects that you have done?
Well, fighting against the OECD's various projects. The OECD, by the way, is an international bureaucracy based in Paris representing governments. And representing governments, it wants to try to squash tax competition to make it easier for governments to raise taxes, raise spending, engage in more redistribution, prop up the unfunded welfare states that are plaguing the Western world. And I've been fighting that ever since they launched their project more than 20 years ago. I want governments to compete. Competition is good in the private sector. And of course, it's also very good in the public sector as well. But also, the Center for Freedom and Prosperity does a lot of domestic policy issues. One of my special projects is trying to get spending caps, which I think are very superior to a balanced budget requirement. Spending caps exist in countries like Switzerland, and you get very, very good results, whereas balanced budget requirements, politicians sometimes use them as an excuse just to raise taxes. So I think spending control, at the very least, should be part of any balanced budget requirement, but really spending control by itself, properly designed, solves all our fiscal problems.
Okay, and that kind of leads to the question actually about the corporate minimum tax, that's being proposed. Has CFNP taken a position on that?
I've written extensively on this Joe Biden, Janet Yellen, that's the Treasury Secretary scheme, right, to try to create basically a cartel, an OPEC for politicians, if you will, where all governments around the world have to agree to a minimum corporate tax rate of 15%. And of course, once that principle is established, then politicians get to say, oh, well, what's the definition of taxable income? And oh, by the way, 15% rate, that's not high enough. Matter of fact, they're already agitating for 25%, even higher. And by the way, what really concerns me in the long run, and by the way, the long run might only be a couple of years, they're going to say, oh, this is such a good idea to have a cartel for corporate taxation so we can all agree to fleece businesses at a higher rate. Let's do the same thing for individual taxes and wealth taxes and capital gains taxes. So I really, really don't like this idea of governments conspiring together to try to take more money from taxpayers to prop up welfare states that in and of themselves are guaranteed to lead to fiscal disaster. Now, the bad news, of course, is that governments around the world, by and large, have agreed to this scheme. There still are some T's to be crossed and I's to be dotted. So I'm still, knock on wood, hoping that the whole thing blows up. But Adam Smith told us, 250 years ago almost, that cartels in the private sector don't work because competition means that there's always an incentive for someone to undercut competing firms. Well, the problem is when governments set up cartels, well, governments are the enforcement agencies, so there's nothing to stop them from setting up a cartel, especially if they threaten to blacklist and impose financial protectionism against the small handful of low-tax jurisdictions out there that might otherwise want to resist this scheme by greedy politicians.
Right, and then it doesn't create the incentive to, locate somewhere else or anything like that. It stifles competition on an international basis.
Yeah, one bit of background that's probably very important for your viewers and listeners to understand is that beginning with the Thatcher and Reagan tax cuts back in the 1980 or so,
right,
we had a very virtuous period of tax competition in the world where average top income tax rates came down on the personal level. Corporate tax rates, which used to be 48%, dropped to an average of less than 24%. And of course, the United States finally caught up when we did our Tax Reform Act in 2017, brought our rate down from 35% to 21%. Well, that's been great for the global economy. But of course, politicians have hated that. They don't like the fact that they don't have sort of a, free rein to raise taxes and try to squeeze more money from their people. And that's why the OECD and other bureaucracies have been pushing for a long time to try to undermine tax competition. And unfortunately, they are now making a bit of progress.
Yeah. If someone wanted to follow your organization, what's a good website or any other place to find out more information?
Well, the Center for Freedom and Prosperity is simply freedomandprosperity.org. Okay. I write a daily column, which is where most of my material initially appears on my blog called International Liberty, and probably the simplest way to find it. I mean, it's technically danieljmitchell.wordpress.com, but go to any search engine and type in Dan Mitchell blog, and I think universally it's the first thing that will come up. And as I said, I write a column every day, not necessarily because I'm a hard worker, but because there are so many boneheaded things that governments do around the world that I have all sorts of material to write about.
Well, occasionally they do good things too. And one example of that is the Chilean retirement system, which may be the closest analogy to Plan for America. And I wanted to get your take on that, explain that to our viewers and listeners, and why it might be in danger now.
Boy, that is a depressing topic. I was actually in Chile last month because they were having a big presidential election where the left had nominated a Bernie Sanders type candidate, Gabriel Boric, who explicitly says he wants to get rid of the system of personal retirement accounts. And running against them was sort of this business type, very bland, but center-right candidate. And unfortunately, Boric won that election. And he doesn't have like ironclad control of Congress down in Chile. So it's not as if everything's a done deal. But basically, this system, and I suppose I should actually explain the system for folks. Starting back in the early 1980s, they created a system where Chilean workers set aside 10% of their income, not for payroll taxes, which of course goes to these unfunded pay-as-you-go systems, but 10% goes into a personally owned private retirement account managed by the private sector. And this system has been enormously successful, especially considering that Chile, you can't really consider them a first world country. They're sort of in that nebulous zone between a developing country and a first world country. They've done a lot of good free market reforms, not just the personal retirement accounts, but these reforms have helped Chile become far and away the richest country in Latin America. And so these personal retirement accounts have generated all sorts of assets for people. They've enabled the Chilean financial sector to develop and prosper. As I already said, and this can't be underscored enough, Chile is the richest country by far in Latin America. But unfortunately, I guess the average voter in Chile didn't really understand the benefits of this system, and they elected this hardcore leftist who says he's going to repeal the system. Now, again, we don't know exactly what's going to happen, but at the very least, I suspect he's going to expand a government program, and he's going to, in effect, tell workers, oh, you no longer have to put your money into these private retirement accounts. Yeah. So if there's no mandatory saving into the funded private system, and the government's taking taxes from you in order to give you a promise of a benefit from a government system, I do worry, especially a lot of financially unsophisticated, perhaps lower income workers will abandon the private system. And heck, they already had some ability to do that during the coronavirus pandemic. The government had a special emergency provision allowing workers to take money out of their retirement accounts. And of course, if you allow workers to take money out of private retirement accounts before retirement, guess what? There's not a lot of money there when it is time to retire. So especially for lower income workers, I think the system was already weakened by some of what the outgoing president did. And this new president, Boric, he's just a hardcore leftist, and he ideologically wants to destroy the system. So this Chilean system of personal retirement accounts has been a role model for the world. It's been a great success, but unfortunately, we might be looking at its final days in terms of its universality at the very least.
Well, I heard Jose Pinera speak one time. He's the one who helped put that in place. I'd love to talk to him again. 40 years of experience is a long test time to know that it was successful and it did work. Have any other countries done anything similar that you know of?
Oh, there are actually several dozen countries around the world that have copied the Chilean system or things that are reasonably close to it. I actually did my PhD dissertation on the private retirement system in Australia. Okay. Now, if you want to try to simplify it, the Australian system is basically universal 401ks, at least the way Americans think about it, whereas the Chilean system is universal IRAs. But you have another system called the Central Provident Fund in Singapore that has worked very successfully. You have either full or partial Social Security private accounts in all sorts of countries in Europe, including Switzerland, Sweden, the Netherlands. Hong Kong adopted such a system. The Faroe Islands, the tiny little sort of quasi-autonomous part of Denmark in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, they have private retirement accounts. So there are other countries in Latin America that did copy Chile and set up these personal retirement accounts. Now, when you're sort of grading all these various plans, I've always put the Chilean system and the Australian system at the top in terms of their universality, their simplicity, the fact that they're well-designed and well-run. And that's why I'm very worried. I don't want to see the Chilean system get eroded or weakened or repealed, because it'll be very bad news in the long run for Chilean workers.
Yes. And that's, as you bring out, it's been a key to their success as a nation over the last 40 years. Anything else you'd add about that before we take a break, the Chilean system or that model?
Well, remember that it's just one piece of an overall reform agenda that enabled Chile to become a rich country by Latin American standards. And that's why the election of this hardcore leftist is so troubling, because it appears that even a country that enjoyed a lot of success because of free market reforms, somehow, if there's not an educational effort to help people draw the link between the reforms that happened and the prosperity that they enjoyed, then it's very possible that a country can take a very big backward step. And of course, I guess we shouldn't be too surprised. We had all sorts of good reforms in the 80s and the 90s under both Reagan and Clinton. And yet the 21st century so far, we've seen presidents of both parties making government bigger. Now, we're not I don't think going quite as radically in the wrong direction as Boric wants to take Chile. But yeah, I think around the world, there's a need for people to have more economic education, which is why things like your podcast hopefully can play a role.
Well, that's great. Well, we'll dive into some of the specific provisions of Plan for America here. We're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back with Dan Mitchell on Plan for America podcast. If you like what you're hearing and want to learn more about Plan for America, visit our website at www.planforamerica.us. There's an extensive Q&A section there, and if you don't see a question you have, then please ask us by email. You can order our book, Plan for America, How to Place the American Dream on a Sure Foundation Forever. That can be found on Amazon.com. You can like us on Facebook. And if you really like what you're hearing, you're welcome to contribute through our website. Plan for America is a nonprofit 501c3 organization, and all contributions are tax deductible. And welcome back to Plan for America podcast. I'm Eric Nager, your host. I'm here with our guest, Dan Mitchell, who's chairman of the Center for Freedom and Prosperity, a think tank based out of Washington, D.C. And before the break, we were talking about the Chilean model of privatized retirement accounts, which is exactly what Plan for America is proposing here in this country. So let's talk about some of the provisions there, Dan. First of all, we are proposing that our plan be done by contract law, contract among the state governments collectively, the federal government, and this private trust to be established, so that it's not so easy to change by legislation. If one president enacts it and then the president of another party is elected, legislation can be undone. Contract law would hopefully give it more staying power. What's your opinion on that?
I'm not a lawyer, so this is just my, I hope, informed speculation. But ultimately, you would have to trust that the courts would prevent a future President AOC or someone like that from undoing any sort of reforms. And obviously, that depends on the quality of the judiciary, especially the justices at the Supreme Court. So I would knock on wood and say, hopefully, the courts would uphold contracts and not pull the rug out from under people. But we certainly saw in the 1930s that if you have a judiciary and a Supreme Court that wants to, in effect, ignore the Constitution or ignore contracts, that can happen. So it's something that that I hope you guys are putting some really ironclad boundaries on.
Okay, well, good cautionary point. Thank you. Another provision is that this is not mandatory. In other words, this is opt-in. Citizens can opt into this program once enacted, or they can stay in the current system, which doesn't offer nearly as many goodies. So we think many people would opt in. If you do choose to opt in, the 15.3% of your payroll taxes would go to an all-market index of U.S. domiciled publicly traded companies. So there'd be no choice of investment. No one's picking winners and losers. It would be an all publicly traded company, and 15.3% put in. What is your take on that?
I like the fact that it's an opt-in voluntary approach. As a matter of fact, since we were just talking about the Chilean system, I should have mentioned that it was voluntary for Chilean workers. They could have stayed in the old government pay-as-you-go system, okay. And something like 95% of them, if not more, opted for the private system because at least back then they understood that empty promises from politicians are not as good as real assets in real private accounts managed by the private sector. So yes, having a voluntary opt-in thing, almost by definition, removes the possibility that there could be demagoguery against the plan. Oh, you're being forced into some risky Wall Street gamble. Well, no, you can simply tell people you can choose, and you can show people the data. Well, here's the giant unfunded liabilities of the current system. Do you really want to trust that? Or do you want to trust this new system with design features A, B, and C? So the voluntary opt-in, just set aside the economics and the financial analysis. Politically, a voluntary opt-in presumably has to be a very wise political step.
Well, we also thought it would be run into the Commerce Clause if we didn't. I mean, if we didn't make it opt-in, then there could be constitutional questions about it. Then you get the benefit of the market returns, which should easily outperform Social Security over time, we think. There are also tax benefits because of the contract. The government has to give up certain things in order to get relieved of the 100+ trillion of unfunded liabilities. One thing they're giving up is that any money contributed to the plan is tax deductible going in and tax-free coming out. So there's no taxation on this money at all, which enhances its return. And then you also get the cash flow in perpetuity, because after all, it's your money. It's not like Social Security that ends when you and your spouse pass. This goes on to your heirs in perpetuity. So these are examples of some of the goodies why we think this would be better. Happy to get your comments on those provisions.
I'm a big believer in a very neutral tax system. So I would even argue you guys are being too generous by having no taxation on the way in and no taxation on the way out. Whether you're talking about a so-called front-ended IRA or a back-ended IRA, for tax purists like me, the idea is that you should tax income one time, but only one time. So you want some sort of tax neutral vehicle. You're creating a tax preferred vehicle. Now, of course, most people don't listen to tax wonky people like me. They look at what's in it for them. And there's no question, if you make this a tax preferred vehicle, that would make it more attractive for people.
Sure.
Now, of course, that then raises the separate question of how does that impact government finances? Because I'm sure, as you know, if the Plan for America actually gets to the stage of being discussed as a serious initiative, you're going to have people sort of poking through every line and say, okay, what's the impact in terms of short-run deficits, long-run deficits, fiscal balance for the country? And so if you're giving up a stream of tax revenue, and of course, I like government having less revenue, so that part definitely appeals to me. But if you're giving up a stream of revenue, it will add to whatever challenges you might face as people try to make assertions that, oh, the country can't afford this.
Yes. Well, our econometric model, which kind of models this, looks at market returns over time, and if you take the Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security off the government's plate, we're talking pre-COVID budgets, they could almost have a balanced budget right then. So we're hopeful about that. Also, one other provision of the plan, there's a 2% funding mechanism. So of the 15.3% that goes in every year, about $1 trillion a year, 2%, the trust takes off the top to pay out current retirees today. So all the promises are kept to the current retirees. And then eventually down the road, that 2% becomes the funding mechanism for government supplanting taxation of any kind. So government is really not being hurt by not having the 15.3%, and wanted you to get your take on that provision as well.
In the long run, there's no question that entitlements as currently designed in the country are going to push us into some sort of Greek-style fiscal crisis. It's simply a function of how those entitlement programs are designed, especially Medicare and Medicaid. And it's a function of the fact that we have falling birth rates and increasing life expectancy. And every time my hair gets grayer, I like the fact that we live longer. But from a fiscal policy perspective, that's not good news for the country. So, I'm obviously not an expert on the details of your plan, but anything that over the long run eases the fiscal pressure of these poorly designed entitlement programs and replaces, or at least partially supplants, those unfunded liabilities with something based on real savings, that's obviously going to be much, much better for the economy. And so, let's keep our eye on the ball. The most important variable, I think, from a fiscal policy perspective is how much is government spending consuming of our private economy? Right now, federal, state, and local government spending, you're talking about 40% of our economy's output being grabbed and spent by government. And it's going up because of the demographics. So if your plan can sort of bend that cost curve and then have it begin to decline over time, that would be great news for the country.
Well, it would do that. And what we've been told, one unique aspect of the plan, and you can weigh in on this too, is that funding mechanism, because most other plans we've seen merely tweak the current system, means test, raising the retirement age, whatever, don't fundamentally solve the problem. The 2% funding mechanism actually pays down and eliminates all the unfunded liabilities. So depending on what you assume about market returns, our model only allows 6.2% market returns, nominal that is, because of the limitations of the Congressional Budget Office. If we have more historic returns in the 10% range, those deficits will be gone a lot quicker. So depending on the assumptions you make, if this plan were enacted today, all unfunded liabilities would be gone somewhere between 2054 and 2071 by our estimates. And then the 2% goes on to fund state and local governments instead of taxation. So that's the overall goal, that 2%. What's your take on the funding mechanism?
Well, again, since I don't know the details of the plan and how things interact on a year-to-year basis, I'll focus on a big picture point, which appears certainly to be part of your plan, and I'm sure that you'll agree with. Let's start with an analogy. If I go out and refinance my house, I'm probably going to spend more money in year one than if I didn't refinance my house.
That's right.
But why do I do it? I do it because in the long run, the savings are sufficient to make it worthwhile. And likewise, when you're talking about entitlement reform and big picture fiscal changes, like your plan for America, I don't worry about what might happen in year one or year 5 or even year 10. I think it's much more important to look at those long run curves. How fast is government growing, especially how fast is government growing relative to the productive sector of the economy? And if your plan sort of takes that cost curve and then begins to bend it down, well, that to me is victory. So I wouldn't worry if it had a higher deficit in year 1, year 3, year 7, or year 11. I'm concerned about is government spending, because government spending is the key variable, not budget deficits. Budget deficits are just one way of financing government, with taxes and I guess money printing being the other options. They're all unpleasant options, which is why the government spending variable is the real key. And if we get that government spending variable to finally head in a downward direction instead of an upward direction, that enables all sorts of good things in the long run to happen for the country.
Well, that is our premise. And by getting these programs off the books of government, they will have less spending. I mean, that's the whole thing. Now, another provision of the plan is that the trust itself, the private trust, can float bonds in order to pay off the current retirees. And one of the provisions of the contract is that the bonds will be guaranteed by the government and the interest paid by the government. But the bonds themselves will actually be retired by the trust. So that, because of the funding mechanism, there is a cash flow there, a growing cash flow that will eventually overwhelm all deficits. I should also add that the plan comes with a comprehensive healthcare plan for every U.S. citizen too, which is also part of this. I don't know if healthcare is as much an area of your expertise, but if you want to touch upon that as well, the healthcare component of this.
I focus on healthcare only in terms of the fiscal policy side of things. Well, actually, I shouldn't say that, because I have written that a major problem with our current system is we have too much what's called third-party payer. If I go out to dinner tonight, whether I go to a McDonald's or I go to a fancy steakhouse, I'm bearing the cost of my choice. And I can decide, do I want a dinner for $6 or do I want a dinner for $60? Well, if I'm purchasing healthcare, if I'm a normal American, I'm either buying with Medicare, Medicaid, or a nominally private insurance policy that's actually derives from a special loophole in the tax code that makes fringe benefits tax-free. So from my perspective as a healthcare consumer, as an ordinary American healthcare consumer, I'm basically buying healthcare with other people's money. And guess what? With that kind of incentive system, I don't care what things cost. And I think that's a big reason why our healthcare system is relatively inefficient and relatively expensive. People are buying healthcare with what they perceive to be other people's money. And what you want people to be, in effect, using what they perceive to be their own money, which is why things like health savings accounts would be a better way. Now, again, when I usually write about healthcare, I'm writing about healthcare in the sense of, oh, look at these giant unfunded liabilities for Medicare and Medicaid. And again, since I don't know the details of your plan, I don't know how quickly those problems get solved. But hopefully, whatever you're doing is not just dealing with the fiscal pressure of the government's healthcare entitlements, but it's also dealing with the fact that so long as we have third-party payer, we won't get the normal benefits that a free market produces in terms of lower prices and efficient outcomes.
Well, we don't have time now to go into all the details, but just the highlights are, it's in effect private single payer. There's going to be provisions for price transparency so consumers can check, because they have $1 million cap on their benefits. So they have to marshal their resources and spend them wisely. And every citizen will have included in your premium a $1,200 health savings account that will be guaranteed to cover all deductibles and copays in a given year. And so whatever is unspent at the end of the year is returned to the consumer tax-free. So there's some incentive there to be proactive about your health care. So we have really thought about that. But one of the key provisions is that no one pays for anyone else's health care. And we have provisions to take care of those who are maybe not employed or what have you, that covers that as well. But we have thought it out, and there's a lot to it. If anything, we've been told the plan is so big, almost too big to succeed, but we're going to keep trying. And any final thoughts on section approach?
The most important thing for every viewer and listener to understand is that if we do nothing, we are guaranteed to have a profound fiscal crisis. That's simply a function of math. It's the demographics of our country, aging population, falling birth rates, combined with entitlement programs that are growing much faster than the private economy. And if the burden of government spending grows faster than the private economy, that's a recipe for endless tax increases. And of course, eventually, the tax increases can't keep up with the government spending, and you wind up with the Greek-style fiscal crisis. So something clearly has to happen. And if your plan for America is the kind of thing that would sort of mesh with my idea of a spending cap, so we're controlling the growth of government relative to the private sector, that would be wonderful news, because we definitely need solutions. And right now, as you can well imagine, politicians are trying to make things worse with new entitlement programs rather than trying to make the situation better.
Well, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to get some traction. This is one reason we have the podcast. Thank you so much for being our guest today, Dan Mitchell. And please join us again for our next episode of Plan for America podcast. If you like what you're hearing and want to learn more about Plan for America, visit our website at www.planforamerica.us. There's an extensive Q&A section there. And if you don't see a question you have, then please ask us by email. You can order our book, Plan for America, How to Place the American Dream on a Sure Foundation Forever. That can be found on Amazon.com. You can like us on Facebook. And if you really like what you're hearing, you're welcome to contribute through our website. Plan for America is a nonprofit 501c3 organization, and all contributions are tax deductible.